through installing and configuring workflow in SharePoint Server 2013. In this scenario, we will use 4 servers, one for SharePoint, one for Workflow Manager, one for Active Directory, and one for SQL Server. Each server will use Windows Server 2012, and also Active Directory will act as the domain controller and will also have the Certificate Services role installed to act as the certificate authority for the Contoso domain. In this scenario, the domain is called contoso.local, and we have named the 4 servers with descriptive names. We also have the assumption that SharePoint Server 2013 is already installed. To install and configure workflow, we need to complete 3 steps. First, we will install and configure Workflow Manager on the Workflow Manager server. Next, we will install Workflow Manager Client on the SharePoint server. And finally, we will run a commandlet on the SharePoint server in order to pair the SharePoint farm with the workflow farm. And that concludes this video. To watch the rest of the videos in this series and to learn more about workflow, check out the Workflow Resource Center on TechNet. This is the 6th part to a video series that will walk through installing and configuring workflow in SharePoint Server 2013. In this part, we'll be testing workflow using SharePoint Designer 2013, and what we're going to want to do is log into the workflow server and use SharePoint Designer to create a workflow using the SharePoint 2013 workflow platform. And remember from the first video that the workflow platform is made possible by Workflow Manager, which is what we've just installed and configured and paired to work. So the first thing I want to do is I want to download SharePoint Designer. So I'm going to the Download Center and typing in SharePoint Designer 2013. I'm scrolling down and looking, so what I want to download is not the preview but the full released version. And I want to download the 64-bit in this scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and click download, and I'm going to run that executable when it's done. And as soon as this is done, what I also want to do is go back to the download center, and I want to update it because I want to make sure that I have the latest updates for SharePoint Designer. So this SharePoint Designer has finished downloading, and it's now beginning the installation. So I'm going to click yes to allow the information to be added to the computer. I'm going to accept the agreement and click continue and install now. And I'm going to actually speed this up a little bit because this can take a few minutes to install on your computer. And once that's done, I'll go ahead and click close. The next thing we want to do is make sure we download the updates for SharePoint Designer. So again, I'm going to search for SharePoint Designer 2013, and I'm going to sort these results from newest to oldest. And I'm going to scroll down, and I want to make sure I'm getting the update for the 64-bit version, not the 32. I installed the 64-bit, so I'll go ahead and download that. And I'll scroll down and click the download button for the 64-bit update for SharePoint Designer. So I'll go ahead and click Run and click Yes to allow the changes to this computer. I'll accept the license agreement, and next this will be installing on the update to the local computer for SharePoint Designer 2013. And as soon as that's done, I'll click OK. And we are now ready to test creating a workflow. So what we'll do is we'll open up SharePoint Designer 2013, and then we'll open up our SharePoint site, and our site is https://sp.contoso.local. Once we've opened it once, it'll show up and we can just click on it to open it, but I'm going to type it in here. And this is connecting to our SharePoint site and opening up our specific instance. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a test list. So we'll create a list called Workflow Test List and click OK. And this list we'll use for testing our workflow. And what I want to do now is I want to scroll down and look at our test list, but what I actually want to do is I want to create a new column for this list that we'll use to test the workflow. So I'm going to jump out of SharePoint Designer, and I'm going to go back into Internet Explorer, and I'm going to open up this test list that we just created. So I'll type in our SharePoint site and hit enter. And you'll notice the workflow test list. This is the list we just created in SharePoint Designer. And I also want to point out that I'm logged into SharePoint as myself and not as one of the SharePoint administrative accounts or setup accounts. And this is because there can be problems if you try to create a workflow using one of the administrative accounts. So in this scenario, I'm logged in as myself. So I'll click on the List tab and I'll click Create Column. And what I want to do is I want to create a column for this list which will store a message that the workflow will post to it when we run the workflow, so that we can confirm that workflow is working properly. So I'll type the name for it, column for workflow, and I'll click OK. The next thing we want to do is jump back over to SharePoint Designer, and we're on the Workflows tab in the navigation, and I'll click the List Workflow, and I'll select the workflow test list that I created. And in here I'll give this a name. I'm just going to call it Add Data to Workflow Test. And notice here that we have the SharePoint 2010 and the 2013 platform. The 2013 platform is the one we just installed and configured. If we hadn't have done this video, we would only have the 2010 platform there. So I'm going to select the 2013 platform, and then I want to add some actions. These are all the different actions in the 2013 workflow platform that we can use to build our workflow. And there's many different actions here that do all sorts of things. In this case, we just want a very simple workflow because we're just testing the functionality between Workflow Manager and SharePoint. So we're going to set an item in the current field. And we're going to select the field is going to be the column for workflow field that we just created. And we're going to give it the value workflow works. And to end this stage of the workflow, I can go to the Actions menu and select Go to Stage. And notice here I can go right to the end of the workflow, but I've noticed that when the workflow completes, it gives the name of the stage in where the workflow completed. So I want to create a new stage, and I'll call it Completed, and I'll rename the first stage Workflow Test, so that I know this is where it's performing the test. And then I'm going to go to the completed stage, and in the completed stage I'll add the action to go to a stage, and this is where I will end the workflow. So that when we look at the results, we'll see that it's in the completed stage when it finished, and we know the workflow has been completed. So I'll go ahead and publish that up to the SharePoint site. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back over to the site in Internet Explorer, and I'm going to create a new item in this list, and I'll call this item Test, and I'll leave the second column I'll leave blank because that's where we want our workflow to write the message. And then I'm going to click the ellipses here, and I'm going to go down to the Workflows selection, and I'm going to select our workflow that we just published. So now the workflow is kicked off and the workflow is working, and we want to now refresh the browser to see the status of our workflow. And you notice our workflow has completed, and it wrote the message that we wanted it to, workflow works. So if we clicked on the completed stage, the completed message, we can see the status is completed. And this is where it's important, where I named the last part of that stage in the workflow as completed. If I left it stage 1, that would continue to say stage 1.